want to go through some of the important parts of the acts that are going to be implemented now that we are done with the French and Indian War. And if you were in class with me, you understand how really important the French and Indian War was, but probably even more the end of the French and Indian War, because 1763 was really a turning point in American history. We see that the proclamation and the behavior of what the British colonial officials felt like they needed to do in order to get along with Native Americans, which angered a lot of the colonists. They felt like they weren't being heard as British citizens, is a really important part of what's going on in the context of the next probably 20 years in American history. So let's get into some of the acts that were passed in order to understand, both these perceived um, grievances and real grievances as well. So the reason why they passed all these acts was obviously to pay for this movement. The war was expensive. This was a 9-year war that Britain did supply a lot of troops, a lot of ammunition and supplies and things like that to North America. The British did win, and now the British are kind of saying, "Hey, colonists, we saved you. Like we saved you. Now you have to pay for it. You have to help us pay for it because you are British citizens." So, the imperial struggle that happens with both indirect and direct taxes, it really begins with the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act is in 1764, and when we were in class, we went through that graphic a little bit together and understand that the Sugar Act was just kind of an extension of that Molasses Act from earlier navigation acts that were put into place. This is more of an indirect tax. Really, the only people it affected were suppliers getting sugar and molasses and sugarcane and things like that from the West Indies, from the Caribbean. There was some boycotting that happened, but not a whole lot. The colonists weren't happy, the merchants weren't happy, but there was not a ton of um, backlash that's happening. The Stamp Act, though, now we're getting into a direct tax. Now this is really affecting almost every colonist, because remember, all of the trade that happened, there were almost all goods were manufactured in England. So anything that was used in the United States, in the American colonies, was coming from Britain, was coming from England. And so the Stamp Act, if you drew yourself a little pictorial, it was even on things like any paper, anything that had to do with like a legal document. Playing cards, sailors hated it because they liked playing cards, dice even. So it was on pretty much anything that had paper on it, and it required like this stamp, this official stamp from the British government. Of course, this is in response to both the Sugar Act, because it wasn't generating the amount of taxes like they thought it would, and then still not being able to pay for the 7 Years' War. The Quartering Act. Now, this is, don't think that, I think you understand what the Quartering Act is, that American colonists had to bill it, had to put up or allow, open their businesses and homes to British soldiers. But it wasn't probably most people's private homes. Maybe now and then it would have been more like if you ran an inn, like an inn or a hotel out of your home. If you had someplace like you owned some sort of business where you could, house a whole bunch of guys coming in, that was kind of the place. And you were just expected to not only like open up your doors to them, but probably even like feed them. And that incurred great cost and kind of hardship on a lot of merchants, a lot of people. And it made a lot of people feel very uncomfortable. Like, I don't know about you, but I would not like want some strange, and I'm coming from a military family, I'd not want some strange army guys coming into my house and sleeping. Now, maybe it wasn't even my house, but maybe it was like right in my backyard, like I had a shed or something out there. I still don't think I'd feel very comfortable. The Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act was passed by, so the Stamp Act got, um, um, rescinded. What's the word I'm looking for? Like taken away. Repealed. That's the word I'm looking for. It got repealed, but it got replaced with the Declaratory Act. So the Stamp Act is not in effect for very long because the colonists are very, very upset about this first direct tax. But unfortunately, the Declaratory Act, they say, okay, fine, we're going to rescind the Stamp Act, but we're going to pass the Declaratory Act. And it basically said Parliament could pass a law in any case whatsoever. Like, it doesn't matter what it's about, what it's for, the purpose, how much it is. We can pass this any law we see fit. It doesn't matter. And that was actually almost like, I think they would have rather had the Stamp Act than the new Declaratory Act. So the Declaratory Act goes into place, and it is not making people happy at all. In fact, people are like boycotting, and it's making things very difficult in the colonies. The Townshend Acts. This is Charles Townshend. He is kind of like the prime minister at that time, and they imposed duties on even more things like glass or tea. Tea is a big one. Paint. On a lot of different enumerated goods. And remember, these are not things that are being manufactured in the United States. So if you don't have them in the United States and you need them, you're not going to get them because, well, you're going to get them if you're going to be willing to pay this extra duty imposed. So this is not going great. So the Townshend Acts are in place. And if you look at that little graph right there, that line, timeline, the Townshend Acts are in place for about 3 years until 1770. And they repeal then all the Townshend Acts because it's actually backfiring. Once again, they realize this is not working. People were starting to do, like with the Townshend Acts, they were starting to make their own clothes at home. Whereas before they would have always got their clothes from, at least middle class and upper class for sure, would have got their clothes from Britain. Now they're starting to do like homespun material and make their own clothes because they're just refusing to pay these duties. So they repeal almost all of the Townshend Acts except they keep the Tea Act. Now the Tea Act is coming in partly to help and the Parliament kind of puts it this way. It is to help the British East India Company. Now the British East India Company, keep in mind, Britain is all over the world, this imperialistic kind of movement all over, and they're big, deep into India. And the British East India Company is struggling financially. And so they repeal all of the Townshend Acts except the Tea Act to basically help the British East India Company, because what they say is, the Townshend Acts are actually not going to hurt British merchants. Like, the British merchants in Britain were being very much affected because of all these boycotts and people were not buying things. And so they repealed the Townshend Acts but kept the tea, and they said, well, the Tea Act won't actually hurt British merchants as much because we don't make the tea. We don't get the tea from Britain. We're getting the tea from India, and that's going to help the British East India Company, this huge conglomerate company. And so we need to just keep the Tea Act. Well, this of course leads to, and you can see the Boston Tea Party. I'm not going to get into the Boston Tea Party right now. I'm going to mention it briefly a little bit, but you know what the deal is, right? They go into the Boston Harbor. They dump out bins and bins and bins, crates and crates and crates of tea that was coming into port on a ship. They kind of like hijacked it in the middle of the night. Now, when I talk about that's who we're going to talk about in a little bit. I often wonder, like, did the fish die in like the port, in the harbor, and what was the ecological effect of the Boston Harbor when that happened? Okay, so, and actually, if you understand why British drink tea today and Americans drink coffee, it's because of the Tea Act. This is when Americans started saying, enough, we are tired of this. And this is when Americans actually start turning to different forms of stimulants in caffeine, and they start drinking coffee instead. Almost 100% in response. The British Parliament and the Crown are so furious furious with the Boston Tea Party that they passed the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts are truly just in response to what the British or what the colonists did at the Boston Tea Party. And the Intolerable Acts are just more, they kind of bring back the Quartering Act. They bring back some of those other declaratory acts where they back to taxing paint, back to taxing ink, back to taxing paper, all of these different things. They bring those back just because they're so mad in response to what happened at the Boston Tea Party. And then finally, the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act is a little bit about this idea of the perceived constraints. So back when the Treaty of Paris was signed and France had to kind of give up most of their claims in the Ohio River Valley, they were pushed into the Quebec region. If you know anything about the French in Quebec especially, they're mostly Catholics. Well, in colonial America, almost 90% of the population is Protestant. Well, the Quebec Act basically said that French governments could kind of govern themselves up in Quebec, and that Catholics could be a part of that government. Like, they didn't have to hide their Catholicism or change in order to be a part of that government. And the colonists were really upset about that. They felt like that was kind of infringing on their I don't want to say their rights, but they just didn't think that that Catholics in France, Quebec, should have those kind of rights and that kind of perceived ability to be in part of that government in France. And so when the Quebec Act was passed, this was Britain's way of saying, we're going to just let you do your thing up in Quebec. And it was a colonist way of saying, wait, we can't even have some of those rights here, but you're letting Catholics do that up in Quebec, like the area that we booted France out of. And so they just didn't like it. They didn't like the feeling that it gave them. Okay, so the last slide I want to get to then. Colonial leaders based their calls for resistance to Britain on arguments about the rights of British subjects. Don't forget this idea. It's starting to change, but remember the idea of Anglicization. British colonists wanted to be British. They wanted to act like British citizens. They wanted to be treated like British citizens. They wanted to dress and eat and act and read and do all these things like British citizens. And they're not being able to do that, they feel. And so now we're starting to see a shift in the way that they think about themselves, and partly because of the Enlightenment. And so it comes with this idea of taxation without representation. No taxation without representation. We're going to hear this over and over again. When you come to class, we're going to read an excerpt from a guy named Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, from a guy named John Dickinson. We first hear this no taxation without representation from a guy named James Otis, and we'll talk about this idea more. But they basically said there is no virtual representation. We need in-person representation in Britain, and if we can't have that, we're going to have a problem. And it comes from the consent of the governed. Basically, colonists were saying, if we don't give you consent, Parliament, to govern us, then you can't actually govern us. It was like a logic thing. It was like, well, if we don't give you consent, you can't actually do it because the consent comes from the governed. And we are the governed. And we didn't say you can pass, for instance, the Intolerable Acts. Or like the, Declaratory Act in which you can make any law whatsoever in any case whatsoever. I mean, that was actually the wording. So they're starting to question these things and bring up logical points that you can't do this. Here we come with the idea of republicanism. And the republicanism is just that, where you have a type of government in a republic where the people give consent to a representative to represent them. In like a direct democracy, they're not all not every single colonist would go over to Britain to be represented in Parliament. It just wouldn't make sense. But they could represent some people to represent them in Parliament, right? That's exactly what a Republican government is. So it would be based on the consent of the governed. Once again, we elect somebody, send them to be me in parliament and represent me, but I'm giving them consent to do that. And so it's all about like election and this kind of philosophy of limited government. A bicameral colonial legislature. This is like John Adams. We'll talk a ton about John Adams later, but this is John Adams who kind of thinks we have to have a bicameral, a two-chamber legislature. And this is working on the Enlightenment ideas of people like Montesquieu, where he talked about separation of powers, where you have to have a two body type of legislature where you have different functions. So if this part only does this type of thing, or this part only does this type of thing, for instance, like administering laws or judging things. So you get the idea of where we're eventually going to have our separation of governments. And then the natural rights. This is just John Locke. This is the idea of everybody has the right to life, liberty, and happiness. And life, liberty, and property, according to John Locke. And for us colonials, we don't feel like you are giving us the right to our life, our liberty, even our property, because, you know, property is like the things that you can have to make your life better. For instance, if you are, say, a merchant. Now think about all of this in the setup of the colonies. If you think about where the most kind of merchant is happening, we're talking mostly about Massachusetts first, because there's tons of merchants there. New York is getting to be a big one because they have such a big harbor, but also in Virginia, because Virginia is producing so much of what they're having to send back to Britain, but not getting the same benefits that they once did. So the last thing there, you see common sense. This is what John Locke kind of talks about. We'll look at both the consent of the government real quick with the social contract with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then common sense, this pamphlet by Thomas Paine, and then additionally we'll look at a short John Locke thing on the consent of the governed. So that's where I actually want to end today. When we come to class, we'll talk about some of the major the players, the colonial rebellers, if you will, who were heavily involved in the first days of the the first days of the American Revolution. So until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.